reading The Hobbit by Tolkien. This is the first in a 4-part series that I picked up at a yard sale. So then we have most people should know, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. And it came in this nice little box set. So we finished up. They were on the mountainsides where not much vegetation is growing. They were stuck on the side of a hill, really bad weather moving in, and they finally found a small cave to shelter in. And I don't have anything that I really annotated. This is just, unless you want to call it world building, because you get this very kind of just prolonged, mundane journey that's going with a little bit of bad weather, and they're just all sticking together. So they found a cave. Fili and Kili found a cave, but they were the younger dwarves, and so they kind of questioned, did you really find a good cave for us? Because oftentimes in this barren land, anything that can be a shelter is already taken. Okay, so they're in the cave, and I'm on page 67, kind of in the middle. And it says, it seemed quite a fair size, but not too large and mysterious. It had a dry floor and some comfortable nooks. At one end there was room for the ponies, and there they stood, mighty glad of the change, steaming and champing in their nose bags. Oin and Gloin wanted to light a fire at the door to dry their clothes, but Gandalf would not hear of it. So they spread out their wet things on the floor and got dry ones out of their bundles. Then they made their blankets comfortable, got out their pipes and blew smoke rings, which Gandalf turned into different colors and set dancing up by the roof to amuse them. They talked and forgot about the storm, and discussed what each would do with his share of the treasure when they got it, which at the moment did not seem so impossible. And so they dropped off to sleep one by one, and that was the last time that they used the ponies, packages, baggages, tools, and paraphernalia that they had brought with them. Dum, dum, dum. It turned out a good thing that night that they had brought little Bilbo with them after all, for somehow he could not go to sleep for a long while. And when he did sleep, he had very nasty dreams. He dreamed that a crack in the wall in the back of the cave got bigger and bigger and opened wider and wider. And he was very afraid, but could not call out or do anything but lie and look. Then he dreamed that the floor of the cave was giving way, and he was slipping, beginning to fall down, goodness knows where to. At that, he woke up with a horrible start and found that part of his dream was true. A crack had opened at the back of the cave and was already a wide passage. He was just in time to see the last of the ponies' tails disappearing into it. Of course, he gave a very loud a yell as a hobbit can give, which is surprising for their size. Out jumped the goblins, big goblins, great ugly-looking goblins, lots of goblins. Before you could say rocks and blocks, there were 6 to each dwarf, at least, and 2 even for Bilbo. And they were all grabbed and carried through the crack before you could say tinder and flint. But not Gandalf. Bilbo's yell had done that much good. It had wakened him up wide in a splintered second, and when goblins came to grab him, there was a terrible flash, like lightning, in the cave, a smell of gunpowder, and several of them fell dead. The crack closed with a snap, and Bilbo and the dwarves were on the wrong side of it. Where was Gandalf? Of what? Of that neither they nor the goblins had any idea, and the goblins did not wait to find out. It was deep, deep, dark, such as only goblins that have taken to living in the heart of the mountains can see through. The passages there were crossed and tangled in all directions, but the goblins knew their way, as well as you do to the nearest post office. And the way went down, and it was most horribly stuffy. The goblins were very rough and pinched unmercifully, and chuckled and laughed in their horrible stony voices. And Bilbo was more unhappy even than when the troll had picked him up by his toes. He wished again and again for his nice, bright hobbit hole, not for the last time. Now there came a glimmer of red light before them. The goblins began to sing or croak, keeping time with the flap of their feet on the stone and shaking their prisoners as well. So now we have more song. It says, clap, snap, the black crack, grip, grab, pinch, nab, and down, down to Goblin Town you go, my lad. Clash, crash, crush, smash, hammer and tongs, knocker and gongs, pound, pound, far underground. Ho, ho, my lad. Swish, smack, whip, crack, batter and beat, yammer and bleat, work, work, nor dare to shirk. While goblins quaff and goblins laugh, round and round, far underground, below, my lad. It sounded truly terrifying. The walls echoed to the clap and snap and the crush and smash, and to the ugly laughter of their ho, ho, my lad. The general meaning of the song was only too plain, for now the goblins took out whips and whipped them with a swish, smack, and set them running as fast as they could in front of them, and more than one of the dwarves were already yammering and bleeding like anything when they stumbled into a big cavern. It was lit by a great red fire in the middle and by torches along the walls, and it was full of goblins. They all laughed and stamped and clapped their hands when the dwarves, with poor little Bilbo at the back and nearest to the whips, came running in, while the goblin drivers whooped and cracked their whips behind. The ponies were already there, huddled in a corner, and there were all the baggages and packages lying broken open and being rummaged by goblins and smelt by goblins and fingered by goblins and quarreled over by goblins. I am afraid that was the last they ever saw of those excellent little ponies, including a jolly, sturdy little white fellow that Ellenrod had lent to Gandalf, since his horse was not suitable for the mountain paths. For goblins eat horses and ponies and donkeys and other much more dreadful things, and they are always hungry. That's a very sad moment for me. I'm definitely going to no happy ending for the ponies. So I haven't had much to annotate for sad moments, but I am still annotating. So that's a very sad moment that it was kind of almost like this trap. There was this nice cave with no extra openings, except that we didn't know the goblins could literally open the cave and create a door. Okay, so just now, however, the prisoners were thinking only of themselves. The goblins chained their hands behind their backs and linked them all together in a line and dragged them to the far end of the cavern, with little Bilbo tugging at the end of the row. There in the shadows, On a large, flat stone sat a tremendous goblin with a huge head, and armed goblins were standing round him carrying the axes and the bent swords that they used. Now, goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. I can think of some people like that sometimes. They don't make anything beautiful in their lives or in their speaking, but they are very clever. They can tunnel and mine as well as any but the most skilled dwarves when they take the trouble, though they are usually untidy and dirty. Hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and also instruments of torture they make very well, or get other people to make their design, prisoners and slaves that have to work till they die for want of air and light. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once. For wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them. And also not working with their own hands more than they could help. But in those days and those wild parts, they had not advanced, as it is called, so far. They did not hate dwarves especially, no more than they hated everybody and everything, and particularly the orderly and prosperous. In some parts, wicked dwarves had even made alliances with them. But they had a special grudge against Thorin's people because of the war which you have heard mentioned, but which does not come into this tale. And anyway, goblins don't care who they catch, as long as it is done smart and secret, and the prisoners are not able to defend themselves. So I'm on the top of page 71 now for 20 minutes of reading. Who are these miserable persons? Said the great goblin. Dwarves. And this, said one of the drivers, pulling at Bilbo's chain so that he fell forward onto his knees. We found them sheltering in our front porch. What do you mean by it? Said the great goblin, turning to Thorin. Up to no good, I'll warrant. Spying on the private business of my people, I guess. Thieves, I shouldn't be surprised to learn. Murderers and friends of elves, not unlikely. Come, what have you to say? Thorin the dwarf at your service, he replied. It was merely a polite nothing. Of all the things which you suspect and imagine, we have no idea at all. We sheltered from a storm in what seemed a convenient cave and unused. Nothing was further from our thoughts than inconveniencing goblins in any way whatever. That was true enough. Said the great goblin. So you say. Might I ask what you were doing up in the mountains at all, and where you are coming from, and where you are going to? In fact, I should like to know all about you. Not that it will do you much good, Thorin Oakenshield. I know too much about your folk already, but let's have the truth, or I will prepare something particularly uncomfortable for you. We were on a journey to visit our relatives, our nephews and nieces, and first, second, and third cousins, and the other descendants of our grandfathers, who live on the east side of these truly hospitable mountains, said Thorin, not quite knowing what to say all at once in a moment. Then obviously the exact truth would not do at all. He is a liar. Oh, truly tremendous one, said one of the drivers. Several of our people were struck by lightning in the cave when we invited these creatures to come below, and they are as dead as stones. Invited being a kind of, invited. They weren't really invited. Their ponies were stolen, and then they were marched like prisoners. Also, he has not explained this. And he held out the sword to which Thorin had worn, the sword which had come from the troll's lair. The great goblin gave a truly awful howl of rage when he looked at it, and all his soldiers gnashed their teeth, clashed their shields, and stamped. They knew the sword at once. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time, when the fair elves of Gondolin hunted them in the hills or did battle before their walls. They had called it Orcrist, goblin cleaver, but the goblins called it simply biter, like a bite. They hated it and hated worse anyone that carried it. Murderers and elf friends, the great goblin shouted. Slash them, beat them, bite them, gnash them. Take them away to dark holes full of snakes and never let them see the light again. He was in such a rage that he jumped off his seat and himself rushed at Thorin with his mouth open. Just at that moment, all the lights in the cavern went out, and the great fire went off, poof, into a tower of blue glowing smoke, right up to the roof, that scattered piercing white sparks all among the goblins. The yells and yammering, croaking, gibbering and jabbering, howls, growls, curses, shrieking and shrieking that followed were beyond description. Several hundred wild cats and wolves being roasted slowly alive together would not have compared with it. That's a very gruesome thing to describe, but I guess gives you a chance. I'm going to underline it as a very kind of sad moment. Several hundred wild cats and wolves being roasted slowly alive together would not have compared with the shrieking, but that feeling of terror and utter disgust is the equivalent of what that shrieking sounded like. So if it gives you a feeling of kind of clenching in your gut and your heart, that is what he wants you to experience. The sparks were burning holes in the goblins, and the smoke that now fell from the roof made the air too thick for even their eyes to see through. Soon they were falling over one another and rolling in heaps on the floor, biting and kicking and fighting as if they had all gone mad. Suddenly, a sword flashed in its own light. Bilbo saw it go right through the great goblin as he stood dumbfounded in the middle of his rage. He fell dead, and the goblin soldiers fled before the sword, shrieking into the darkness. The sword went back into its sheath. "Follow me quick," said a voice fierce and quiet. And before Bilbo understood what had happened, he was trotting along again as fast as he could trot at the end of the line, down more dark passages, with the yells of the goblin hall growing fainter behind him. A pale light was leading them on. "Quicker, quicker," said the voice. "The torches will soon be relit." "Half a minute," said Dory, who was at the back next to Bilbo, and a decent fellow. He made the hobbit scramble on his shoulders as best he could with his tied hands, and then off they all went at a run, with a clink-clink of chains and many a stumble, since they had no hands to steady themselves with. I guess their hands are tied behind them in kind of like a chain, and they all have to run together if they're going to make it. Not for a long while did they stop, and by that time they must have been right down in the very mountain's heart. Then Gandalf lit up his wand. Of course it was Gandalf. But just then they were too busy to ask how he got there. He took out his sword again, and again it flashed in the dark by itself. It burned with a rage that made it gleam if goblins were about. Now it was bright as blue flame, for delight in the killing of the great lord of the cave. It made no trouble whatever of cutting through the goblin chains and setting all the prisoners free as quickly as possible. This sword's name was Glamoring the Foehammer, if you remember. The goblins just called it beater, like you beat somebody, and hated it worse than biter, if possible. Orcrist, too, had been saved, for Gandalf had brought it along as well, snatching it from one of the terrified guards. Gandalf thought of most things, and though he could not do everything, he could do a great deal for his friends in a tight corner. So we're going to pause there. I've had the first of a couple of very sad moments. And so I will go back. I just underlined them, and I will go back and highlight them in blue. And kind of maybe that last little bit where it says, Gandalf thought of most things, and though he could not do everything, he could do a great deal for his friends in a tight corner. I will highlight that in red for love and loyalty. And just kind of think of your friends, and while we are human and we can't do everything, there are some things that we can do for each other and when we call upon each other. So that's our 20 minutes. We've gone a little bit over, but I'm now on page 73.